Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we have a special treat, a Blitz match between the top two Blitz players in the world. The highest rated Blitz player in the world, as many of you know, is Alireza Firouzja, rated over 2904. This is the official FIDE Blitz rating. The second highest rated player is Hikaru Nakamura, rated 2879 in Blitz. And they played a 10-game Blitz match on chess.com. Well, it was more than 10 games, but there were 10 decisive games in the match. And I'd like to cover those games. This video will be covering the first two of those games. And it's always nice to see Alireza. He's been in hiding a little bit, and we definitely who are his fans, want to see him play as often as possible. Let's begin. In this first game, Hikaru has the white pieces, Firouzja has black. d4, knight f6, and Firouzja plays a Grunfeld defense. The idea is that black wants to let white build a center, but then attack it with everything he's got. Bishop f4. This is a calmer way of handling this position for white. Bishop g7, e3, castles, and rook to c1. The rook moves to the c file, which could potentially open after an exchange on d5. Bishop to e6 to help solidify this pawn and put pressure on c4. And Hikaru decides to go ahead and play c5, gain space. Now, when he does this, black's main source of counterplay is going to be this e7, e5 pawn push, which he's a long way off from making right now. But at some point, he's going to have to arrange that push to get any counterplay at all. Knight to c6. More common is c6 or even knight to h5, attacking this bishop. Because if he can get rid of this bishop, which controls e5, it makes it easier for him to push that pawn. But knight to c6 was played, which directly affects this square. And Hikaru plays bishop to b5, so he can get the knight off the board. Remember, everything is starting to revolve around this e5 square. Knight to h5, bishop to g5, a6, and now he takes the knight with the bishop, bc6. Now, black does have the two bishops, but the position is blocked. So in order for Firouzja to take advantage of those bishops, he's going to have to open up the position. h3 controls g4, and also white can play g4 himself. Queen to e8. The queen is lining up, so when this bishop at e6 moves, he'll be able to play e5, g4 hits the knight. The knight moves back, but computers show that Firouzja had a really powerful idea here, and that's the move f6. And so instead of moving the knight, he would counterattack the bishop, and if one variation of the bishop moves is just g5, and if you take here, black is a bit better. He can move the king out of the way, bishop f7, e5, the rook can go to g8. Black has some pretty easy play there, but he plays the more natural move, knight to f6, now bishop to f4. Reestablishing control over e5, but now aiming at the c7 square, and rook to a7. This is not what you want to do with this rook. The rook is quite passive, but he uses it to defend the c7 square. Bishop to e5, placing this bishop opposite the dark squared bishop, and Firouzja doesn't like that. So he plays bishop to h6. Stepping outside of that, he doesn't want to trade off the bishop, and the idea is he will play knight to d5, kick back black's bishop, and then move his bishop back to play e5. So knight to f3 was played next. Computers actually like white just taking the knight, and after ef6 playing king to d2, but humans do not play this way. The computer's idea is you play the knight to e2, the queen shifts over to g1, and white just kind of attacks on the king side, but again, people don't do that, particularly not in Blitz. Knight to f3, knight to d7, hitting that bishop, bishop g3, and now f6. The idea is to play the bishop to f7, and then e5, gaining that central space. Queen to a4, attacking c6, and now queen to a8, defends c6. But look at these heavy pieces. These queen and rook, Firouzja would rather not have his queen and rook offside like that on the queen side. Castles, bishop to f7, b4 gaining space, and now rook to e8, and black is ready to play e5. Rook c to d1 is played, and then e5. Now here, computers show that e4, just opening up the center and creating a real mess, was probably white's best bet. But instead, Hikaru plays g5. And here, Firouzja probably should have just taken the pawn. But instead, he plays e4. And then pawn takes bishop, pawn takes knight. And now after e4, Hikaru has a pull. Although playing rook to d to e1 first and preparing e4 that way was probably a little bit better. But he goes ahead and plays e4 immediately. de4, now d5, gaining further space. And here, if cd5 was actually black's best decision, even though he would hang his knight, the reason is this variation. c6, attacking the queen. Queen moves to d6, rook to e6, attacking the queen again. After queen b8, queens are exchanged, but then rook to b7, and after the bishop moves, rook takes b4. And white is up a piece, it's true, but black has 3 pawns for it, and there's this massive central pawn chain. So black would have quite a bit of good counterplay here, but instead he plays knight to e5, which is a mistake, and Hikaru probably should have just taken the now unprotected e4 pawn. But instead he plays the move d6, going through the middle of the board. And the knight goes back to d7, and now dc7, and this pawn on c7 is pretty much decisive on its own, protected by the bishop at g3, which cannot be challenged. There's no other dark-squared bishop on the board. Hikaru is in complete control in this game. Rook to e7 to defend the knight, but now knight takes e4, and if the rook takes the knight, then white would take black's knight. And the computer gives white an evaluation in this final position of plus 10. So the first game in this blitz match goes to Hikaru with the white pieces. Let's go to the second decisive game. In this game, Firouzja has white, Hikaru has black, and Firouzja begins with e4, and after e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, Hikaru plays the Berlin defense and d3, avoiding the Berlin endgame, bishop c5 and c3, castles, castles, and Hikaru immediately plays d5, seeking to open up the center as quickly as possible, knight b to d2, and then he just takes on e4, creating a symmetrical pawn structure. a5, this is usually a common idea. When white has this pawn on c3 like this, he can always play b4. So in this case, black plays a5 to control that square, queen to c2 to add to the defense of the e4 pawn, queen e7, h3 to keep a piece out of g4. And here we already have a novelty. Hikaru plays knight to b8. The idea is that this knight has no future, right? It can't go here. It's denied access to the b4 and d4 squares. Knight to d8 has been played before, but knight b8, basically the idea is to reroute the knight and to get it active in a different way. Bishop to e2, b6. He wants to challenge this e4 pawn with bishop to b7. Knight to c4. Firouzja counterattacks the pawn on e5. And now bishop to b7, attacking this pawn. Now, it turns out Firouzja probably should have gone ahead and just taken that pawn on e5. And after Hikaru would have taken on e4, just bishop to d3, bishop takes, knight takes. And white has a very comfortable position. He's attacking this bishop. The rook can go to e1. The bishop at c1 can develop freely. So this would have been a good position for Firouzja. But he goes ahead and defends the pawn first. And now knight b to d7, and Hikaru defends e5. Knight to e3, threatening to jump into f5, which is, we know, a very strong square when you have this pawn structure of pawns at e4 and e5. g6 to keep the knight out of f5. Rook to e1, rook f d8. Now knight to f1. Firouzja has a really diabolical and brilliant idea with this knight, which we'll see in a minute. Bishop goes to d6, knight to g3. One thing it can do is support an h4, h5 push, but that's not what Firouzja has in mind. Knight to c5, again, piling up on this e4 pawn. The bishop moves to c4, a more active diagonal. Bishop to a6, a very strong move, forcing off the trade of this strong light-squared bishop from white. Bishop a6, knight takes a6. Bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen. Queen to e6, and here is Firouzja's diabolical idea. He plays the move knight to f5, an incredible positional piece sacrifice. The idea is that if he takes the knight, then pawn takes, queen moves, and then knight to d4. There's a pin along the c-file, so he can't take the knight, and he would be threatening knight to c6, forking the queen and the rook. And after knight to b8, to control this square, he could just play rook a to d1, and he's down a piece, but he has a lot of positional pressure, which is tough to deal with in a blitz game. Computers give this zeros. They say this is an equal position, even though white is down an entire piece. But Hikaru sort of didn't want to get into trouble, so he actually doesn't take the knight. He plays the bishop back to f8. Knight goes back to e3. Now the idea is to take this knight and then on f6 and then jump in with his own knight, the d5 square. Bishop goes to e7, queen to b3. If you look at this position, you'll see that black's queen is much better placed than white's queen. It has far more scope. So Firouzja says, well, let's just trade them. I'll trade a worse placed piece for a better placed piece, which is always a good strategic idea. Queens come off the board, rook to e8. Now bishop takes knight, bishop takes, and now Firouzja is able to jump into d5 with his knight, attacking c7 as well as the bishop on f6. The bishop moves back to defend, and now b4. He'd love to open up this file and create all kinds of trouble. If black takes on b4, he actually would just be losing, because after knight takes, he piles on to the pinned knight on a6, and the game would essentially be over. So instead, Hikaru plays c6 to kick the knight at d5 out first. The knight goes back to e3, and then he takes on b4. cb4 and b5. Black wants to fix this b4 pawn here as a weakness and maybe later attack it with his bishop and knight. The rook goes to c1 attacking c6. The rook defends it from e6. Rook to a3. The idea now is to double rooks on the a file and win the pinned knight. So the knight moves to c7. Rook c to a1. Now rook to b8 to avoid the exchange. Rook to a7, establishing a rook on the 7th rank. h5. Now rook to d1. What Firouzja wants to do is basically capture the bishop. Then when rook takes rook, the rook would take the knight, and he would win 2 minor pieces for a rook, which would leave him in very good shape in this endgame. So Hikaru evades that with knight to e8, but that allows Firouzja to double rooks on the 7th rank, getting a very active position. The bishop goes to b6, which of course attacks the rook. And probably the best decision for Firouzja here would have just been to play rook a to b7, allow the exchange of one of the rooks while keeping the other rook on the 7th. But instead, he goes ahead and takes on f7. He says, I'm going to give up the exchange for piece activity. Bishop takes rook, rook takes bishop, and here white has a knight and a pawn in exchange for a rook. The knight goes to d6, attacking the pawn at e4. Knight to g5 hits the rook, but also defends this pawn. The rook goes to f6. Now f3. The pawn is strongly defended with this pawn chain. Knight to f7. He wants to challenge this well-placed knight on g5. h4, knight g5, hg5, and rook to f7. Basically, black would do best with a pure rook versus knight endgame, get a pair of rooks exchanged. So rook to a6 attacks the c6 pawn. Firouzja does not want to do that. Rook c8 defends. Now knight to d1. Rook to d7, which attacks the knight. Knight to f2. Rook d4. King to h2. And there's a bit of a trap here. It would be a mistake for Hikaru to take on b4, which just seems like the most obvious move in the world. But then knight to d3 would basically completely equalize the position. He would be attacking the rook and the pawn at e5. So when the rook moves, he would take on e5 with a double attack on the g6 pawn and the c6 pawn, and basically he would totally equalize. The knight would be as strong as a rook in that case. So Hikaru instead avoids that pawn and plays rook to d2, puts his own rook on the 7th, and of course attacks the knight and the pawn. Knight to h3, rook takes b2, f4, seeking to gain counterplay on the king side. Rook takes b4, now f5, hoping to come in and get some activity. Rook takes e4, f6, rook to c7. He wants to keep white's rook from getting control of the 7th rank, and he also wants to control f7, or if this pawn advances, he'll be able to take it. Rook to a8 check, king to f7, rook to h8. Firouzja is threatening rook h7, which would win the rook on c7. When the king moves, he would just pick up the rook. King goes to e6, rook e8, king back to f7, rook back to h8. Now king to e6, and he doesn't bother repeating, because actually after rook e8, Hikaru could just play king to f5, and he'd be totally winning in that position. So instead, he plays the rook to g8, going after the g6 pawn. b4, rook takes g6, b3, rook to g8. So now Firouzja wants to place his rook behind the passed pawn to keep it from advancing further. So can you see what Hikaru does in this position? That's right, he plays rook to b4. He puts his own rook behind the passed pawn before Firouzja has a chance to. And after rook e8, king to f5, rook to h8, b2. And in this position, the pawn cannot be stopped. And Hikaru wins also the second game in this match. But believe me, as we move forward, there's going to be a lot of interesting developments. If you're a Firouzja fan, there's some good things on the way, trust me. But as of the end of this video, in this match, Hikaru was up 2 games to 0. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.